My talk is about basically how birds have changed over time in Minnesota, and we're using the Breeding Bird Atlas as a tool to illustrate a lot of that. Now, how many of you have heard of the atlas? Okay, so maybe about half of you. So I'm going to start with a bit of an overview of that, but it'll be quick enough for those who already know about it that you won't spend too much time on it. For those who don't, it'll be in-depth enough that you'll come away with some understanding of it. So that's the talk. The content is primarily by myself and my primary colleague, Dr. Jerry Nimi, who's from the University of Minnesota at Duluth, and literally hundreds of other people who contributed to the atlas over the 5 years it was underway. Like I said, I'm going to start with a quick overview of the Breeding Bird Atlas. We use BBA as the acronym, so if I throw out BBA a lot of times, I'm always referring to the atlas. Give you a really quick summary of the data, give you some examples of our products, and then the major focus will be on looking at 12 different changes in our avifauna over the last 100 years. 6 are good, 6 are bad. I'll start with the bad and end up with the good. And then just some quick ideas of where you can find some more information. There is a handout in the back about an upcoming book that summarizes all of this. So briefly, what is an atlas? I think you all know that it's a collection of maps and charts. The Delorme Atlas for Minnesota is a great example. It tells you how to get from point A to point B. And this is traditionally what atlases have always been. But the noun atlas has actually transformed into a verb called atlasing. So what is atlasing? Well, it's the process of geographically cataloging the distribution and abundance of elements of biodiversity during a very established time period that can be repeated. Now, historically, biologists have always used broad range maps to depict a species distribution, and we still do because there's still a lot of value. For example, the map on the left, vertical and horizontal lines show the distribution of 3 different plants in Great Britain. This map is a map that you're probably all familiar with. It's the eastern meadowlark. The orange shows the breeding range, and the purple, the wintering range. So when we want to depict how far something occurs over a large area, range maps are really useful. But atlasing phenomena has kind of changed the whole process of looking at species. And it actually began in Great Britain in the 1950s when British botanists really wanted more detailed information on how and where different plants occurred. And they designed a process that had 3 primary components. The first was that the searches were conducted by knowledgeable volunteers, like every one of you in this room. The field work occurs over a very defined time period, usually a couple of years to 3 or 4 years. And it's conducted within a very fine scaled grid, so you can get information at a very local level. The Atlas of British Flora was actually published in 1962, and this is an example of the map. And it may be a little hard to see, but you see a cluster of dots in the bottom of the aisle. But the dots go all the way up here. If you were to draw a range map, it would include 3/4 of the aisle. But that wouldn't tell you the whole story, because the whole story is that the species is really primarily focused in the southern part. So you can see atlases give you a much finer scale of information about a species. Well, because birding is so popular, the atlasing phenomena quickly spread to include birds, both in Europe and North America. The Atlas of Breeding Birds in Britain and Ireland was published in 1976, and then it jumped over to the ocean, took a firm foothold in New England, and the first Atlas of Breeding Birds in New England was published in Vermont in 1985. Now, by the year 2000, Minnesota was the only state in the Mississippi River Valley that had not yet conducted an atlas. And we are one of 7 states in the lower 48 that hadn't done that. But we've been watching it. So a coalition of Minnesota conservation organizations who've been kind of watching this from afar began work to raise money to conduct an atlas of breeding birds in Minnesota. And I won't go through all this, but they basically raised $1.5 million from a number of great organizations, including the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. From the time we really launched it, after we got the money, to today has been 14 years. We've been working on it the whole time. Field preparation began in 2008. We had our defined time period, which was 5 years, so it was the breeding seasons from 2009 to 2013. Then we spent the next 4 years summarizing and analyzing the data, designing a website and launching that in November 2017. And then since January 2018, we've been working on a book that will come out in this fall. So the core of every atlas is how you do the sampling. And in Minnesota, our state is divided by the U.S. Public Land Survey into townships, and each township is 36 square miles. So what the atlas technical team did was took each township and divided it into 4 quadrats. Each quadrat you see on the right was 9 by 9 square miles. So we had 9 square mile blocks in each township. The northeast quadrat was defined as a priority for sampling. We literally can't be in every place in Minnesota, so you have to kind of set a systematic way of looking at it. So we designed that northeast quadrat as a priority. There are over 2,300 priority blocks in the state and a total of 9,700 blocks in the state. We had 4 major ways of collecting data. The first was from volunteers like yourself. We had hundreds of volunteers who collected data. The priority was to collect them from those 2,300 priority blocks. If they had time, they went to the other blocks. And we had A was the priority block, B, C, and D. So you could go to other blocks if you wanted to, but we really put our emphasis on collecting data from that priority block. Oops. Then, you know, Minnesota is a huge state. It's not all very accessible. We also hired field staff and sent them to the most remote areas of the state to ensure that we really had good coverage of the entire state. We also solicited data. So there are species that are hard to survey, there are species that are rare. So data that was collected during that same 5-year period from 2009 to 2013 was solicited from organizations like the DNR, the Rough Grouse Society, a whole bunch of groups that do different inventories, such as the Great Lakes owls, the Biological Survey, the colonial water birds that are done, and game bird surveys. And finally, we augmented all this with, in each of those 2,300 priority blocks, we hired very skilled field staff to conduct 3 10-minute point counts in each of those priority blocks. So what they would do is go out in the field and for 10 minutes record everything they heard and saw within that 10 minutes. And took us 5 years to do all 2,300 blocks. Because again, they're not all very accessible. So it could take a whole morning to do just even one priority block. So again, it was another method to really ensure an unbiased sampling of birds and that we really had good coverage of the state. Now when you're out in the field, you would classify every detection in one of 4 ways. It was an observed bird, a possible breeder, a probable breeder, or a confirmed breeder. And there was a whole list of criteria, as you imagine, for each of those 4 categories. But the overall goal was to identify as many species as possible as confirmed breeders. So that's what an atlas is. That was your quick run through of what an atlas is. And hopefully it was enough information to give you a sense that it's a great tool for conservation planning because it's such a local fine scale. It really allows you to look at relationships between where birds occur and other environmental factors. And most importantly, when it's repeated, it provides really accurate assessments of changes over time. You know, rather than going, yeah, I remember in 1980 there were a lot more avocets at Lake Billsby, and today I only saw 1. This will give you a more accurate way to really quantify those changes over time. And I'm going to give you an example. This is a henso sparrow, an uncommon grassland bird in Minnesota. Now, New York was one of the first states to conduct an atlas, and this was their first atlas in 1980 to 1985, and this was what they learned about the distribution of the henso sparrow. Pretty common bird, actually. They repeated the atlas 20 years later, and this was the distribution of the henso sparrow. And again, if you were to draw a range map, they'd be identical. But clearly, the henso sparrow is not doing as well 20 years later. It still occupies the same range, but far less common. And centers of abundance have really changed over time too. So that is the value of an atlas. Quick summary on our data. During those 5 years, 5 breeding seasons, we had a little over 400,000 records for 250 species. And of the 250, we were successful in confirming breeding for 231 of them. How does that compare to other numbers out there? Well, it's very similar to the number reported in 3 neighboring states who also, when they conducted their first atlas. We had 250, Wisconsin had 237, Michigan had 233, Iowa 199. And how does it compare to all the numbers of species that have been reported in Minnesota? Well, there's 443 that have been recorded in Minnesota, and so you go, 250, that's not too great. But you have to remember that the vast majority of those other species are migrants, vagrants, and winter visitants. So in terms of species that are actually coming here to breed each summer, 250 is really pretty good. Of the 9,700 blocks, we had more than 10 observations in over 4,700. And of the priority blocks, we had more than 10 observations in all but 15 of the priority blocks. So, which bird was most frequently observed? I'm going to answer it because we're short of time. Robin, with 10,227 detections. The second one is a little harder, I think, for most people to guess. The species that we had the second highest detections for. Common yellowthroat, which I doubt many people would guess, but when you think of the common yellowthroat, it's everywhere. Yeah. Little bird that's everywhere. Its range of habitats that it occupies is just phenomenal. You know, it's a generalist species. Coming in third was a red-winged blackbird, fourth song sparrow, fifth red-eyed vireo, sixth crow, 7 chipping sparrow, and 8 blue jay. Now this is just total number of detections. How about which were the rarest species? We had 5 that we only saw once during the whole 5 years. Burrowing owl, Clark's grebe, not western grebe, but Clark's grebe, white-eyed vireo, yellow-throated warbler, and lark bunting. Lark bunting used to be more common in the state in particular. The others are more kind of newcomers. Oh, and burrowing owl as well. So I want to show you quickly some of the products of the atlas because I'm going to show you those a number of times in the future slides. This is the most important product of the atlas, the species distribution map. What I'm showing you is the species distribution map for the white-throated sparrow. There are 4 colors. The colors correspond to those 4 breeding categories: observed, possible, probable, and confirmed. Dark blue is confirmed. I can show it to you. This is by priority blocks. We have on the website, there's a lot of different ways you can see this, but whoops, I keep doing that. You can also show it by county. So clearly the white-throated sparrow has a very sharp line, actually, where it's most abundant in the northern forest. We also, at each of the point counts, collected data on habitat for each species. Again, this is the white-throated sparrow. It loves the bogs, and it really likes upland conifer forest and lowland conifer forest. And we also took pictures of the typical breeding habitat of each species, which is on the web and in the book. We also combined the point count, or all the data from the volunteers, with data on the environment, climate, topography, landscape, and did a predictive model for most of the species where we had enough data. And this is the predicted distribution model for the white-throated sparrow. And as you can see, the yellow is where it's least common, the border of the northern forest, orange more common, and it's most abundant up in the really deep northern forest areas. We also did something I think was pretty interesting, which was we used the data to develop more accurate population estimates for birds. And I want to give you a little history on this because I think it helps put it in context. In the past, and actually still today, population estimates, largely for songbirds, have been generated on data collected by the Federal Breeding Bird Survey, BBS, not BBA. And what that survey is a system or a network of over 4,600 roadside routes throughout southern Canada and the continental United States. Each route is 25 miles long with 50 stops every half mile, and volunteers like myself and Jen do those routes once during the height of the breeding season, get out of our car every half mile and record everything we hear and see. And that is a huge collection of data that's been collected since 1966 in the United States. And when you look at that map, you say, wow, that's going to provide really great population data. Unfortunately, when you step it down to the state level, there's far fewer routes. So of those 4,600, Minnesota has 84, and they cover the range of the state, but there's some big gaps. It doesn't cover the entire state. Furthermore, of those 84 routes, usually only about 70. I mean, it depends on volunteers, the weather's bad, it's too far to drive, whatever. So about 70 of those 84 are sampled each year. And so if 50 stops per 70, you have about 3,500 points in Minnesota each year with some population data. Now, compare that to the Breeding Bird Atlas. This is where all our point counts were. We had 9,100 10-minute sampling points that covered 99% of the state. So where are you going to get more accurate population data? From the map on the right than from the map on the left. And we use that to our advantage in the atlas. Now, I just mentioned this quickly because I sometimes don't stop myself. So if you hear me say BBA, I'm referring to the atlas. If you hear me say BBS, I'm referring to those roadside counts. And I'm going to use those both fairly frequently. So finally, what we did with the atlas is we took that data from 5 years and really placed it in a historical context. So we looked to see how things had changed in the last 100, 150 years. Even back to the explorers. Some of the explorers have good records of what they saw in Minnesota. They were usually the big birds, not the tiny ones like the common yellowthroat, but provides a good marker. And Dr. Hatch in 1892 wrote one of the first compilations of Minnesota birds, followed by, I'm sure you all know, T.S. Roberts, who wrote this just incredible 2-volume book on Minnesota birds in 1932 with an update in 1936. And to this day, it's one of the best state compilations of birds in the state at the time of settlement of any state in the U.S. And then there's, as you know, these are probably all in your library. There's all sorts of other books that have been written since then, and we looked at each one of those to see what they said about all these species and how things had changed. And we also looked at the County Biological Survey, which many of you may know, and also have a wealth of information on the Chippewa and Superior National Forest, where there's been a monitoring program for songbirds for over 25 years. And it just really provides us great information on how things are changing on our national forests. And we looked at everything that's ever been published on every species to try to put it in historical context as well. So, now we'll look at how things have changed. And I'm sure you can guess many of these, not all of them, but many of these. And the first most obvious one is the devastating impact of the loss of Minnesota's native prairie. The map on the right, all the yellow area is what used to be native prairie. The little red you can see, maybe you can see it still in the back, but it's what remains today of native prairie. So of course that had a major impact on our birds. Now Minnesota lies on the very eastern edge of the grasslands that are in the Central Plains and the Northern Plains. And that has a lot of bearing on what occurs here, because species are most vulnerable on the edge of their breeding range to changes. And we'll see that. We actually began losing species 100 years ago, and we have good documentation because of T.S. Roberts. And a couple of the species were the big ones that were easy to shoot, like the long-bird curlew and the whooping crane. Shooting was one of the primary reasons they were lost. But then we also lost a little one like the thick-billed longspur. These are native prairie, native grassland species. So that happened over 100 years ago. Well, we had another kind of round of extirpations from the state about 50 to 70 years ago. And these were the littler ones. This is the Baird sparrow, Sprague's pipit, and chestnut-colored longspur. Now, when you look at the range maps for each of these, it might be pretty obvious why they were the first to go. This is the Baird sparrow. Remember, the orange is their breeding range, Sprague's pipit, and chestnut-colored longspur. And you can see that they all three have a very small breeding range in the northern Great Plains, and they hardly get to Minnesota. Minnesota is just on the very edge of their range. So they are, again, most vulnerable to loss because of their small range and our loss of native habitat. Now, unfortunately, these losses continue today. And I'm going to use an example, the Upland Sandpiper. Now this species has a much broader breeding range across north central US, though its real population kind of in east of Wisconsin is primarily limited to airport runways nowadays. In Robert's days, particularly in the late 1800s, it was present everywhere. He used the phrase, it was present in countless thousands in any of the open country in Minnesota. In the 1970s, its range map was basically considered most of Minnesota, with the exception of the very far northeast corner of the state. The County Biological Survey gave us more precise information. You can see all those red dots. It's really primarily limited to the western part of the state. And during the atlas, you can see again, it's primarily limited to the western part of the state. But I want to point out two major differences. Look at all the red on the Biological Survey, which was done primarily in the 80s. You don't see many dots in northwestern Minnesota during the atlas, about 30 years later. Something's happening. Well, the loss of native prairie in all grasslands is continuing. And even during a 5-year period from 2008 to 2012, nationwide, we lost 3.6 million acres of grassland within 100 miles of ethanol refineries. No surprise there. Total, keep going to the long one. Total, we lost 5.6 million acres of grasslands. Now, some of those weren't native prairie. They were restored grasslands, pastures, etc. But still, a lot of species that use native prairie use restored grasslands. Well, back in the 1930s, the federal government started programs to compensate farmers to take farmland out of production and give them a payment. And that was done in the 1930s to help control soil erosion. And that program continued over the years, and its most important change occurred with the 1985 Food Security Act, when they really broadened the environmental sensitivities of lands that could be compensated for. So what happened, it was called the Conservation Reserve Program. Again, it continued annual payments to farmers to remove environmentally sensitive agricultural lands and plant them with species, grassland species. They couldn't convert them to a forest, but convert them to grassland. And to this day, that is the most important conservation tool for protecting grassland species, not only in the United States, but in Minnesota. There's a problem with the program, however, and that it's very suspect to the vagaries of the commodity market. So when farm prices are high, crop prices are high, farmers are not going to put their land in CRP because they can get more by planting and selling the crop. When farm prices are low, CRP is a good benefit for them. So this shows kind of what happened. In 2007, the entire United States had nearly 37 million acres in CRP. By 2020, we only had 21 million acres. There's a lot of reasons. CRP is a complicated program, but basically it was a loss of 16 million acres of grassland in the United States. In Minnesota, we lost 700,000 acres during that same time period, with a predicted loss of at least another 300,000 by 2019. And here's a map that shows the areas in red are where the greatest losses were. And let's point out where one of those greatest losses were. Northwestern Minnesota, right where we saw the loss of upland sandpipers. So it's occurring right in our own backyard still. So what happens is when commodity prices are high, CRP enrollment goes down, and grassland bird populations go down. And overall, we have not the 36 million acres we had in the early 2000s has never recovered. We've never gone back to anything as high as that. So that's the first major thing. The second one is how we've impacted our wetlands. And I'm sure you all know we've lost over 50% of our wetlands in Minnesota. Pictures like this rarely exist anymore. This is Swan Lake down in Nicollet County. And drainage was a big factor. But when you look at the suite of wetland species, from waterfowl to shorebirds to herons to rails, actually wetland drainage wasn't the first problem. It was unregulated harvest during the settlement periods. And Tom Miller, who was an old guide and scout down near Heron Lake in Jackson County, wrote that between 1883 and 1893, several thousand redhead ducks were killed every single year at Heron Lake. So that's one lake. It's a big lake, but still several thousand per year. And that went on for decades. So it wasn't until the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed in 1918 that harvest regulations were enacted, and some of these populations slowly began to rebound. But drainage really never continued to be a huge problem and actually increased in terms of its impact on these species. Now, overall, wetland trends in the United States, I mentioned we've lost over 50,000 or 50% of our original wetland acres, and estimates are that we're still losing about 50,000 per year. It's still a lot. In Minnesota, we originally started with, we've lost about 50%, but we have one important tool. It's the 1991 Wetland Conservation Act. And this prohibits the loss of most wetlands, not all wetlands, unless they're replaced by created or restored wetlands. So it's basically referred to as no net loss policy. Well, about 15 years after the act was passed, they began a monitoring program to see, well, you know, are we really accomplishing what we set out to accomplish? And the good news was that indeed we were. During an 8-year period, the results showed a net gain of almost 9,000 wetland acres in Minnesota. So that's a good thing. 9,000 acres, not a big dip in what we've lost, but it's better than losing. The problem is that we're replacing natural wetlands with created and restored wetlands, and there's some concern as to whether or not they really had the full range of values that the original wetland had. And this is North Ottawa Impoundment. I'm sure some of you have been there. It's a great wetland restoration project up in Grant County. And evidence that things are still not as they should be is when you look at the populations of any of our wetland species, none of them are increasing. And the blue-winged teal is a real sentinel species in this regard. Roberts in the 1930s said it was the most common duck in Minnesota during the breeding season. During the Atlas, it's widely distributed, but you really could only say it's common in the very edge of west central Minnesota. Indeed, today it's far outstripped by the mallard and the wood duck. So it's dropped from top place down to third place. And then this is its national population trend, and it's actually going up. And that's largely because conditions in the center of the Great Plains are doing better. Wetland conditions are better. But this is its population trend in west central Minnesota. It's stable to decreasing. And that's a specific waterfowl survey. If you look at the breeding bird survey for Minnesota, it's really dramatic, downward decline. And this is the same, these same pictures were repeated for almost every waterfowl species in Minnesota, including many shorebirds and rails as well. So things are still not doing particularly well. Number 3, decline of many nocturnal birds. And I'm going to use the eastern screech owl as an example. In Robert's time, it was the most common owl in Minnesota. Today, it's probably pretty hard to see the dots back there, right? There's not many dots on that map. And they're mostly in southern Minnesota. Indeed, the number of screech owl detections during the Atlas was far exceeded by the number of barred owls, the number of great horned owls, the number of saw-whet owls, and believe it or not, the number of great gray owls, which we've kind of considered a rare species in Minnesota. So the screech owl is really not doing very well. Some of the possible factors was actually very adaptable to develop landscapes. So you'd think that would be a positive in Minnesota. It doesn't do well after unusually cold winters, which we have a lot of, but actually this is one species that may benefit from warmer climate. But the biggest problem is that it's prey for high populations of potential predators like the great horned owl and the barred owl, which have outnumbered almost 100 to 1 the number of screech owls. When my husband and I first moved into our South Minneapolis home, we had screech owl in our backyard that would call during the summer. Haven't seen it for 15 years, easily. But we have lots of barred owls calling every night. Number 4, declines in many aerial insectivores, like the flycatchers. Well, I'm going to focus on the purple martin. Robert said this was a common statewide resident. In fact, it was so common in the early 1900s, it wasn't nesting in martin houses, it was nesting in natural cavities. And even Roberts had a picture in his book that I loved. It was nesting in the crevices of this little rocky islet in the middle of Lake Mille Lacs. And that colony was there for over 40 years. Well, 40 years later, Green and Jansen said it's statewide in occurrence, mostly along the Mississippi River Valley and in central and southern Minnesota. The Biological Survey found most records in central and southern Minnesota. During the atlas, again, not a common species, mostly in central Minnesota still. But I'd like to point out, it's fun to point out a couple things on this map. Here's all the purple martin houses along the southern edge of Lake of the Woods. Here's all the purple martin houses around Leech Lake, and this is my most fun atlas map. Lake Mille Lacs, totally surrounded by purple martin houses. There's dark blue outlining the entire shoreline of Lake Mille Lacs. But when you look at the breeding bird survey data, martins have declined an average of 5% per year since 1967 for a cumulative decline of over 90%. And that's the dramatic decline right there. Factors that impact them: high population density and industrial development impacts, and there's good evidence nowadays that that really impacts aerial insect populations. And again, this is a map produced with BBS data. All the red shows where the purple martin is declining, and the blue where they're increasing. Look at where they're declining. It's the whole industrial belt along the southern Great Lakes in the northeastern United States. Other impacts are cold, wet springs that really impact migrating aerial insectivores, nest competition with house sparrows and starlings. And because we've now made them a real colonial species in these little nest boxes, they're really vulnerable to predators and nest parasites. But perhaps the biggest factor is that there are fewer homeowners maintaining purple martin houses. And Kelly Applegate, who is with the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, wrote that the martin house used to be kind of an American tradition. Back in the 1950s, you had your American flag and your purple martin house in your front yard. And people just aren't as interested in maintaining those nowadays. This is one of many houses along the south shore of Lake of the Woods. And I don't know if any of you have ridden out on westward on Highway 212. This house is very, very obvious. It just has a ton of purple martin houses that are very active. It's always fun to see that. Number 5, a lot of species are not doing well, from night herons to plovers to several of our warblers. And there's different reasons for all of these. The Cerulean Warbler is a good example. It occurs throughout the north central United States. It was a rare resident in southeastern Minnesota in the 30s, gradually started to move northwest. 40 years later, it was as far north as Minoan County, and this was its possible range map. During the biological survey, the range is still pretty similar, but very few occurrences. There was 138 occurrences during the biological survey. During the atlas, only 45. And the real problem, this species is considered kind of a hallmark. It's one of the songbirds that's decreased more than any other songbird in North America, about 72% over a 30-year period. And the problem for the Cerulean Warbler is that it really likes tall, mature forest, deciduous forests. And you know, it's in that southeastern belt to central Minnesota where Rochester, the Twin Cities, St. Cloud occurs. It's just not as much habitat available for it. It's not a species that can adapt to coniferous forests or to grasslands at all. Number 6. This is not an outcome of the Breeding Bird Atlas, but it's so important, and it's really such a topic today that I really wanted to share with you the impacts of climate change. And this is work done by National Audubon. But the reason this is a concern in Minnesota is we are one of the fastest warming states in the lower 48. And we have this plethora of just beautiful species that are really restricted to our boreal forest. It's one of the things that makes Minnesota really unique. So what National Audubon did was they took all the population data that the BBS had generated, combined it with environmental data, landscape data, topography, everything you can imagine, to develop models to predict the impacts of a rise of 1.5 degrees centigrade, 2 degrees centigrade, and 3 degrees centigrade on these species. And the results are quite alarming. The boreal chickadee is our example here, aptly named. It occurs in the boreal forest, primarily up in Lake and Cook County. The yellow is its current distribution. And you can see it just barely gets into northeastern Minnesota, but it's primarily a Canadian species of boreal forest. This is what happens at 1.5 degrees centigrade. The area in red is where it disappears, which includes all of northeastern Minnesota and the Great Lakes. The area in yellow is where the population stays the same. The area in blue is where it increases, potentially. That's 1.5 degrees centigrade. Most biologists consider us already at that point, if not nearly so. 2 degrees centigrade, almost entirely gone from the boreal forest to Canada, and even starting to disappear in Canada, or in Alaska. But you can see the amount of red is not compensated by the amount of blue. And this is at 3 degrees centigrade. It's even gone from Alaska. And this was the case for almost every boreal species that currently occurs in Minnesota. In fact, at 1.5 degrees centigrade, we lose 27 species predicted, of which 18 are boreal. And by 3 degrees centigrade, we lose 64 species as breeding components of our avifauna. Over 31 of those are boreal species. So it's devastating. It's one of the reasons we need to take climate change seriously. Things are going to change. And there's just not enough room on the continent for these species just to move north. And those habitats may not change fast enough to accommodate the species that we're losing here in Minnesota. So I really encourage you to go to the Audubon site. It's called Survival by Degrees, and you can find what happens to every single species in Minnesota. So starting with the good news, we have a lot of conservation efforts that have been very successful in Minnesota, and this clearly would come out as the top for everyone that they mentioned. In Robert's day, there was eagles along every single large lake and major river in Minnesota. But by the 1930s, seeing eagles was really a rare exception. Well, today, they were confirmed breeding in 76 of our 87 counties, and were present in all but 2 of our counties. Trumpeter swan is another one that I think people would mention. Breeding resident throughout the grasslands of Minnesota. By 1932, Robert said the days of the trumpeter swan are probably gone. They look like they're doing pretty good. Confirmed breeding in 55 of our 87 counties and present in 72 counties. Then I like to give this story because it's not one we often think of, but it's actually our first conservation success story that's turned in many directions. You know, the Canada goose is a very diverse species. It normally occurs just in Canada and the north central United States. Very diverse across the breeding range in size and colors and everything. And to show you the distinction, there was 11 subspecies identified from the smallest cackling goose to one of the larger ones, Moffitt's Canada goose. So there really are dramatic differences. Today, those subspecies has divided into 2 species, the giant Canada goose and the cackling goose. In late 1900s, they were gone from southern Minnesota. In 1932, they were gone from northern Minnesota because of drainage. And the last documented nesting in the state was in 1929. Well, private waterfowl breeding was a common thing back in the day, especially among the elite, which included in Minnesota the Mayo brothers. And Charles, one of the brothers, built this huge estate. Maybe some of you have visited it, called Mayo Wood. 3,000 acres, has wetlands on it, and what he did was brought Canada geese in. He bought some from a North Dakota breeder and brought them to his estate in 1924. Well, the city of Rochester did the same thing and put some birds on Silver Lake. In 1939, Dr. Mayo stopped feeding his birds and they went to Silver Lake. In 1948, a power plant was built on Silver Lake, which meant the warm water discharge kept the lake open all winter and enticed geese from unknown breeding grounds to overwinter in Rochester. I see a lot of shaking heads. By 1960, that flock had grown to nearly 4,000 birds, which led to the rediscovery of the long-lost giant Canada goose. Because the residents said, you know, some of these birds that are showing up are huge. They're just really large. And it turned out that some of them had bands on that showed that they were remnant population of the giant Canada goose nesting in Manitoba. Well, that led to just this huge surge of reintroduction efforts throughout Minnesota and the Midwest. You know, so it was formerly kind of confined to the northern Great Plains. Now it occurs everywhere. And in Minnesota, it's in every single county and confirmed breeding in every single county. And it's actually gone from statewide extirpation to statewide abundance to nuisance, and as you know, in some areas, local control as well. Species number 8, we have species reoccupying parts of the state where they originally occurred. Common loon is a great example, used to occur throughout the state, but by the 1970s, it was really gone for most of southern Minnesota. During the Atlas, it's really expanded. We even have records down in the heart of the agricultural country. And many of these birds are probably not breeding, but some of them may soon breed, because you know in the Twin Cities we have a lot more loons than we used to 20, 30 years ago. The northern harriet is another great example. Undeniably the most abundant hawk back in the 1800s. It reduced in numbers, finally disappeared from all of southern Minnesota, and today it's really statewide in occurrence. So it's really reoccupied much of its former breeding range. Same story for the clay-colored sparrow. Used to be very abundant, then gradually disappeared from the southern part of the state. Occurs nearly everywhere now. And then we've actually, most of these, we've seen a gradual actual range expansion of some species. Most of the times when species expand in Minnesota, they're coming from the south going north. We've got great examples: the cardinal, the gnatcatcher, the red-bellied woodpecker, the great-tailed grackle, and the Eurasian collared dove were more recent entrants into the state. And the red-bellied woodpecker is just an amazing story because it wasn't even here 100 years ago. Hatch didn't record it. Roberts had his first nesting in Red Wing in 1903. By 1970, it was primarily in the southeast and gradually expanding north. And then by 87, it was basically the southern half of the state. During the Atlas, you may not be able to see it, but there are records all the way up to the Canadian border. And this is all the dark blue are areas where it's breeding now. So it's now reported in 80 of Minnesota's 87 counties and confirmed nesting in 49 of them. Yeah. Really. Now, bird feeding has probably helped this, as have warmer winters. But it's also a very adaptable species. Now we have a couple species that appear to be moving contrary direction from the north to the south. One is the common raven. There are no nesting records by Roberts or Hatch in the 30s. Finally, the first nest showed up on the Rainy River, right on the Canadian border. Now, it's disputable if we ever had ravens in pre-settlement times. It turns out Wisconsin did and Michigan did. But it's odd that Roberts didn't notice them if they were here. So a little hard to understand. But it's gradually been expanding from the Canadian border further to the west and to the south. So this black line is where it was in the 1980s. You can see it's really expanding to the south and west. Same is true for the merlin. I'll just talk about that real briefly and show you. It used to just be along the northern Canadian border. And when you look at this map, you can see, I mean, Gary and I had a bird nesting 2 blocks away from us. We're in the center of South Minneapolis 2 years ago. These birds are really adapted to the urban environments. And so they used to be restricted to the Canadian border, and look at how broad they are today. I want to get back to those population sizes. We have, what we've learned from the BBA is that many of these species are more common than we thought. And just to remind you, that's because we're using this data and not this data. So what was the most abundant species? The little common yellowthroat. We previously estimated with the BBS data 5 million birds. Our Atlas data said nearly 15 million birds in Minnesota, 3 times as many. Second most abundant species, this one's another one, hard one to guess. Horned lark. Over 1/3 of Minnesota counties are 75% cropland. And where do you see horned larks? In cropland. Often hiding, but they're out there. Our previous estimate was 1 million birds in Minnesota. Now we estimated 12 million. There's a lot of birds out there. And you know, when you just stop at one cornfield, right now, this time of year, you're going to see a huge abundance of them. And other species that are far more common. Song sparrow came in at number 3, Nocturnal warbler, red-winged blackbird, and red-eyed vireo. 2 more to go. The importance of wetlands in northwestern Minnesota. What I'm looking at is this whole area up here. The area in dark are the forested peatlands, the area light are mineral wetlands. I'm going to go through about 5 birds here where you see the predictive distribution map really puts them solidly in this northwest. That was the Connecticut warbler, olive-sided flycatcher, Lincoln sparrow, swamp sparrow, which is widely distributed, but look where it's most abundant, and the yellow rail. Not widely distributed. Everyone thinks of going to McGregor Marsh, but look at where it's really abundant, right along the Canadian border in those northwest wetlands. So the reason that they're abundant up there is we've also protected a lot of those lands as national wildlife refuges, state wildlife areas, and scientific and natural areas. And finally, we have a unique responsibility for 2 species, and I imagine most of you know what one of those is. It's the golden-winged warbler. It used to occur throughout both colored areas. It now doesn't occur anywhere in gray, and it has 2 disjunct populations, one in the northern Great Lakes and one in the Appalachians. But when you look at the relative abundance map, Minnesota, it's hard to see, but the one area of greatest abundance is in central Minnesota. Indeed, that was proven by the Breeding Bird Atlas, and Minnesota is estimated to support nearly 57% of the global population of golden-winged warblers. Our previous estimate was that we had 220,000. The good news is it looks like we have over 1 million birds here, and they really are abundant in that whole Mille Lacs region. And another species that I don't think people think about is the sedge-wren. Much wider distribution, but the center of its abundance is in the northern Great Plains, basically in central Minnesota and central North Dakota. Very widespread during the BBA, but again, those northwest wetlands are so important and really a core of its distribution. We support over 30% of the global population, I should say the US and Canadian population. This is an odd species, it's very nomadic. Formerly estimated we had about 1.5 million in Minnesota, now nearly 5 million with the new data. So a lot of things to find. I urge you to go to our BBA website. We've gotten a lot of great feedback. I think it's one of the better atlas websites in the United States, mnbirdatlas.org. We also, as I mentioned, have we have a book coming out in this fall that summarizes everything I've said and more. And in summary, just what we have is the first time in Minnesota's history of really detailed information at a fine scale, the distribution of Minnesota birds, that allows us to, it's a treasure chest of data that will really guide conservation in the next 100 years. Provides a lot of insights into how things have changed over time, and most importantly, if we repeat it in 15 to 25 years, it'll be even more valuable. So I'll just end with a little quote from Thomas Lovejoy: if you take care of birds, you take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.